So the Voice to Parliament referendum failed, and I've been sitting here for the past week and a half, racking my fucking brain trying to figure out how in God's name did this referendum not pass? Now the obvious answer, of course, is racism, and there may be an element of truth to this, but I refuse to believe the majority of Australia's population are just racist cunts. So ruling that out leaves us with only one possible explanation, and this may shock some of you, but it's that Aussies are dumb as fuck. Now maybe dumb as fuck is a bit of a harsh term, but hear me out. I put out a poll on my story asking people why they voted no to The Voice, and majority of the responses came from who didn't have a fucking clue what was happening. The most common response that I got was that there wasn't enough information. Now this response is so fucking stupid because with one Google search, I can bring up hundreds of articles with facts and details about The Voice. I mean, there's even a whole book written about it for fuck's sakes. The only two pieces of information that the government didn't provide, which I reckon might have been useful, is how much it would cost and who would be in charge of it. But in their defense, it's always going to be hard to tell how much these things cost. And it is actually stipulated in the referendum that the Voice of Parliament board would be made up of representatives which were elected by Indigenous communities. Like, what were they meant to do? Go out to Indigenous communities, get them to elect their representatives, figure out the salaries for these representatives all before the referendum had passed? Could you imagine if the government did this and the referendum didn't pass? How bad that would make them look to these communities. Plus, I mean, you only have to look at the 1999 Republican referendum to see why they didn't include this information. And that referendum included one of the most highly detailed models of a republic that the world had ever seen, with a whole budget and everything figured out. But for that referendum, one of the main arguments for the No campaign was that there was too much information and it was too confusing. I mean, they even use the same "if you don't know, vote no" tagline that they're using in this referendum. Another common response I got to why people voted no was that it would cause division. Now let me just remind you that an Indigenous Voice to Parliament wasn't going to have any actual real power. It was just an advisory board. If an advisory board is going to cause division, then why don't we just disband all the other advisory boards in our government? The only structural difference between The Voice and all those other advisory boards was that The Voice was going to be constitutionally enshrined. And the reason for this wasn't because of some secret government ploy. It was simply so future governments couldn't just abolish the advisory board when they got into power, like what the Howard government did with the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Committee. I even had some people telling me that the Voice to Parliament was causing division simply because the referendum was proposed as a yes or no question. Like, if that was your reason for voting no, then aren't you just contributing to the division by picking a side? Wouldn't you just be better off not voting at all? If you're really against division like you say you are, then stand up for your beliefs and cop the fine then. Now the third and arguably dumbest reason I got for why people voted no to a Voice to Parliament was because they didn't trust the government. Now don't get me wrong, I'm the last person to tell you to trust the government, but if you're voting no for this reason, you clearly have no fucking idea how the government works. So Parliament mainly consists of two parties, the Liberal and Labor Party. The Labor Party were the main ones advocating for the yes case, whereas the Liberal Party were the main ones advocating for the no case. And while the Labor Party is in power at the moment, since the Liberal Party was formed in 1949, it's been in power for nearly 2/3 of the time. So basically, by voting no, not only have you just followed the word of the ruling party, but you also followed the word of an ex-police officer. And on top of that, you've just voted against an Indigenous board that's literally there to advise the government and make sure it's doing right by Indigenous people. Now, while these responses do prove my point that Aussies are dumb I will admit it's not entirely our fault. First of all, I'll just start by saying that Labor's Yes campaign was shit. Like, their ad campaign did virtually fuck all to inform people on what the Voice of Parliament actually was. Like, with the millions of dollars you had, that was the best you could do. Like, mate, I only got $50 to my name, and even I could do a better job than that.
Introducing the all-new Indigenous Voice to Parliament. Don't worry, we're not going to steal your house. It's literally just an advisory board. Come and vote yes now.
But honestly, I reckon Labor could have had the best yes campaign possible and it still wouldn't have passed. This is because of a little thing called
mainstream media bias.
Now, this is a bit of a complex subject, but to put it briefly, there are three main players in Australia's media landscape. But the main one I like to focus on is News Corp, which is owned by this guy, Rupert Murdoch. News Corp owns nearly 2/3 of newspapers circulating in Australia's metropolitan areas. Actually, let me just read out some of News Corp's assets to give you a bigger picture. So in television, News Corp owns Foxtel, and it also owns the Australian News Channel, which includes Sky News Australia. And for newspapers and magazines, it owns the
Australian, the Daily Telegraph, the Sunday Telegraph, the Herald Sun, the Sunday Herald Sun, the Courier Mail, the Sunday Mail, Brisbane News, the Mercury, the Sunday Tasmanian,
So we've established that Murdoch owns News Corp, and News Corp dominates the media landscape, meaning it controls the narrative of basically any news story. Not only does he own News Corp, but he also owns millions of dollars worth of shares in the Genie Oil and Gas Company. And it basically goes without saying that anyone with ties to the fossil fuel industry is directly harmed by an Indigenous voice to Parliament. This is because if Indigenous people actually have an input into things which affect them, which is what the voice was going to do, then they can stop fossil fuel companies from fucking up their land. Take a look at Jucan Gorge, a 46,000-year-old cave, which included numerous Indigenous artifacts. It was blown up by Rio Tinto, a mining company, despite Indigenous representatives of the land warning them not to. If Indigenous people were granted a voice to Parliament, then shit like that can't happen, and Murdoch misses out on all that sweet mining money made from fucking up Indigenous landmarks. The amount of misinformation spread by News Corp was fucking astounding, and it's pretty obvious to see from this graph that he wasn't on the yes side. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, you guys aren't dumb cunts, you just got played.